Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Critical Kunic, its continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no person has gone before. Wait a second, what? How do you have a Star Trek campaign and somehow turn it into a horror story? What the fuck? Back in the 90s, a mutual friend of our D&D group, Brad, suggested running a FASA Star Trek RPG for us at his house. He'd bought all of the books months earlier and hadn't played it yet. Most of us were fans of Star Trek The Next Generation, and all of us were/are nerds. So we agreed. As a longtime DM, I suggested a session 0 where we decided the era we'd play, The Next Generation, created player characters, and figured out what kind of campaign we should play. The concept we pitched to Brad at session 0 was to have a prototype reconnaissance ship with a cloaking device that could explore new worlds without starting wars or violating the Prime Directive. And Kunic here, speaking as a huge TNG nerd, this sounds exactly like the Pegasus, just with maybe a slight difference to it. For those that know, know. For those that don't, check out the final season of The Next Generation. It's awesome. GM Brad agreed on the condition that the Klingons knew we'd stolen the cloaking tech and were out to take it back. An awesome plot point. We'd also be in the furthest reaches of Federation space, so Brad could feel free to throw anything at us and homebrew a campaign. For a first-time game master, Brad was pretty good. He wrote a couple of great adventures and managed our shenanigans for a few months of the campaign. There were several great storylines going on, and I enjoyed the change-up from being a forever DM. We'd even encountered Q, who's a godlike cosmic being, which was a fun connection to the show. One adventure, though, we managed to evade the Klingons with quick thinking and cloaking. Our party's chief of engineering managed to kill the engines and redirect power to life support and cloaking, meaning no exhaust would be present to locate our ship. Hell yeah! Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. For some reason, Brad seemed pissed at that outcome. Best guess is he wanted to run a ship-to-ship combat. He never said that. For our part, the recon bird would have been absolutely wrecked by a Klingon bird of prey, so we hid. Brave? Nah, but smart. The adventure ended with us avoiding the big bad evil guy through suspense rather than action. It was an awesome session. The next session, not so much. Brad kicked off by announcing that the Federation was canceling our prototype project, and we would need to return our bird to Federation space. The USS Archangel would be decommissioned. The party was floored. We got over the initial shock. Then the captain, me, did his best Kirk impression to give the crew a motivational and inspiring speech that boiled down to, "We've risked everything and proven the value of the Archangel and her crew. Any who wish to return to Federation space and get reassigned, shuttlecrafts are ready. But we're not going back. To hell with the Federation. We stay and finish what we've started." The crew were all in. Brad, however, was visibly pissed. "You'd be hunted down. You can't be pirates." The party were all for going rogue, in-game and at the table. Brad takes a deep breath, and the next thing we know, the Borg show up and catch us in the open. We weren't fast enough to run, and we definitely weren't strong enough to fight. For every plan we pitched, Brad had a reason it couldn't work. "Well, what are our options?" "You could call on Q," Brad said. We debated, since Q is basically a trickster god. Finally, we decided it was the only option. Q arrives and somehow launches our warp core at the Borg ship, destroying it in a fantastic explosion. But it also stranded our ship in deep space with only impulse engines. Brad told us without warp engines, we would be months from the nearest station that could repair our ship. And without a warp core, we wouldn't have enough power to use our cloaking device either. We tried to bargain with Q to no avail. We were sitting ducks. The session ended with the party being completely deflated and Brad grinning smugly at how well he'd railroaded his players and ended the campaign he'd done so well at building. Dude chose to burn it all down, then let his players do something different. And as a note, we never played RPGs with Brad again. But the rest of us are still doing a weekly D&D group 30 years later, so there is at least a happy ending. End post. Okay, this is one of those rare instances, it seems, where the OP try to portray their party in a positive light, but I honestly think everyone at the table here is a D-bag. So let's dive into it. First, let's talk about the DM. So the DM was new, and a lot of DMs, when they're new, will begin to railroad. That's pretty typical. They're trying to learn how to improvise. So I'm not going to fault him at doing that. I will say, though, that he went a little hard at the railroading at the very end, so he probably should have held off on that. But again, he may not have known how to do what the players really wanted to do well. A fallacy that a lot of new DMs fall into is that they perceive that there's only one real solution to a problem when there are generally multiple solutions. And for Star Trek, that really should fall under the avoiding combat at all cost philosophy more than combat. So I do think he should have probably built the campaign around avoiding combat instead of getting into ship-to-ship combat. And of course, doing everything he could to railroad them and punish the players at the end is no good either. Though that's not me defending what he finally did, which was railroad them to the point of basically a TPK. That's not good, right? There were lessons to certainly have been learned there. And he probably got those lessons when the entire party decided to abandon him as a friend. And that's where I go on to the other side of the story, where I think the people that were playing at the table were also, like, they're not innocent here. You don't abandon an entire person off of what they did as a DM in one instance. If everything leading up to this moment was great, and then yeah, they were a little bit of a D-bag there at the end, that's kind of going nuclear on this one person. And if we were to dive into the Star Trek aspect of this, because again, I am a huge Star Trek nerd, what they were doing was very atypical for anyone in the Federation. I can't imagine whatever their task was being worth it to give up the Federation and have them perpetually hunt you down. Now, there is a faction in Star Trek that does this called the Maquis, but they have a very important reason for doing that is told throughout many episodes and in fact serials of Star Trek. It began in Star Trek The Next Generation and carried over into Deep Space Nine and then Voyager. It's in 3 different series and is an incredibly nuanced story and reasoning as to why someone would leave the Federation. Leaving the Federation simply because you lose your toy is not valid in my opinion. And as a DM, I probably would have punished the players as well for making such a choice. It doesn't make sense. Now, we're not told the reasoning as to why they decided to do it, so there could have likely been a very valid reason to it. But to mutiny against the Federation over losing your cloaking devices is really silly. Now, should they have lost their cloaking device to begin with? No. They should definitely not have. Using it in a tactical reason to avoid combat, I think should be promoted. Nonetheless, they lost access to it, or they were going to have it taken away. So they really went nuclear in that direction as well. Yeah, this is a tough one. I think both sides had lessons to learn. The players themselves, I think, were a little bit more hardcore and ultimately rude in the instance here than the DM. Again, not excusing what the DM did, but just adding a devil's advocate side to the whole picture. Now then, keeping with the Star Trek theme, onwards to our next story. I'm playing a character that is a joined Trill, a character who is a living flight recorder in the abdomen that gets plugged into the next guy after the host dies. At one time, I used singular pronouns when describing the character: she, I, etc. Since my character has been joined, I've been saying we, they, and so forth. My character no longer sees herself as a singular person, but as one aspect of a larger whole, to the point of saying I'm proud to be joined to the symbiote, as opposed to saying I'm proud that the symbiote joined me. The DM wrote a paragraph about how he doesn't do preferred pronouns for characters, only for me to say she has a slug in her abdomen. She's worried about both of them. Did I do something wrong to set him off? Now, why am I posting here? Under further consideration and review, I've come to the conclusion that the DM I have is controlling, to say the least. What I'm primarily concerned about are 2 things. I have a character vision, it gets approved, and the DM suggests I play the character's antithesis 2 sessions in. Examples: a friendly anthropologist versus a murderous spy, or as seen above, a person who is Zen-like, which is even represented mechanically in the game with attribute scores and talents, versus someone who is overwhelmed by memories not originally their own. Every time I have declined the revision. Secondly, he has a 1d100 chart for vices that he wants all characters to roll 3d100 on, where depending the role, your character is a psychopath, dying, severely mentally ill, or disabled. When confronted, he asserts it's just for roleplay, and that he only uses it to make complications for characters. I have been with the group for nearly 4 months now, 2 months on the DM-initiated hiatus over November and December, and I have not once seen those things brought into play. What I'm asking is either, 1, how do I approach the DM about my concerns in a tactful manner? If that is no longer an option for whatever reason, 2, aid in locating another Star Trek Adventures game. End post. Well, I can't help with number 2, but that is my recommendation. Leave the game. There's a lot that I can say here, but I'll just say this. Since its inception, Star Trek has been one of the most inclusive TV shows in all of civilization, frankly. I mean, we're talking about back in the Next Generation in the first, second, and I think even up to like the 5th and 4th seasons, you saw men wearing skirts and no character within the universe batted an eyelash at it. At its core, it's inclusive. And really the point is, if it's not impacting you, why should you care? That's the narrative reason behind it. There's no reason to fight against it. And for someone to be the game master of a Star Trek game and not understand, or even worse, agree with being inclusive, goes against the fundamentals of Star Trek as a whole. And I don't like being a gatekeeper, but they're not a real Star Trek fan if this is how they view the world. Because if they were, they would probably despise Star Trek for what it represents. And I'm not going to get any more political about it. As I said, I'm a Star Trek nerd, take it with what you will. Anyhow, that is all for today's episode. If you liked it and you want to see more videos just like this one, be sure to hit that subscribe button and bell notification icon to be notified of my future videos. In addition, while I had to skip this week, I am putting out a podcast generally every Monday over on my podcast channel, which is not on YouTube, but you can find it in the description below, or if you search Short Tales of RPG Horror in any podcast app, it'll show up. Now then, while you wait for my future videos, here are a few related videos that you can watch of mine in the meantime.